Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Dean of Vermont School for the Environment, and we're very pleased to welcome you today. Each of these talks is worth 1 CLE credit in Vermont, and if you're looking to use that credit for your reporting, keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We'll have time for Q&A after the presentation today. And if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, you can enter your questions in the chat or comment space, and we'll get through as many of the questions as we can. Today, we're pleased to welcome Warigia Bowman. Professor Bowman is Associate Professor of Law and Director of Sustainable Energy and Resources Law at the University of Tulsa College of Law. With extensive law and policy experience in local, state, and federal government, as well as in the nonprofit sector, Professor Bowman teaches water law, natural resources law, and administrative law. She has a BA from Columbia College at Columbia University, her JD from the University of Texas School of Law at Austin, a master's from the LBJ School of Public Affairs from the University of Texas at Austin, and a PhD from the JFK School of Government at Harvard University. After law school, Professor Bowman clerked for Justice Jack Hightower of the Texas Supreme Court and served as an honors trial attorney in the Environmental and Natural Resources Division at the U.S. Department of Justice under Attorney General Janet Reno. She has published widely on telecommunications and regulatory issues, public policy, infrastructure, water, and energy. Along with 34 interdisciplinary researchers, Professor Bowman was recently awarded part of a multi-million National Science Foundation grant administered by the established program to stimulate competitive research. She's consulted for the Kenyan government, USAID, the United Nations, and the US State Department. Before joining the University of Tulsa, she taught at the American University in Cairo, Egypt during the Revolution of 2011, as well as the University of Mississippi and the University of Arkansas. Professor Bowman's work is multidisciplinary and informed by the fields of history, law, science, and technology studies, as well as political science. And she's interested in energy, water, infrastructure, regulation, elections, telecommunications, both in the southwestern United States and in Africa. Professor Bowman joins us this summer as our Distinguished Environmental Law Summer Scholar at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And today she'll present a talk titled Surviving the Megadrought. Please join me in welcoming Professor Warigia Bowman.
Hi, everyone. Well, it's great to be here. So what I'm talking to you about today is a work in progress, and I am still working out some of the kinks, but I wanted to share with you some of the big issues. So I will not take up the entire time, but I will be speak for part of the time, and then we can have a more interactive conversation. So out in Vermont, we have had an experience of wildfires coming from Canada, and luckily it kind of passed over Vermont, but really hit New York hard. And part of that is that our forests are getting increasingly dry. So even though it feels like we're getting a lot of rain right now, and this is, an unusually wet year, if you look over a century or 50 years or even 20 years, overall, we're experiencing heightened temperatures. And this is particularly serious in the Southwest because the Southwest is much, 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 much drier than the Northeast. So the Southwest is in a megadrought, and there are historical cycles of drought in the Southwest, but this is the worst megadrought which the Southwest has experienced in the last 500 years, and it's at least partially caused by global warming. So some of the symptoms we're seeing are reduced river flow, reduced snowpack, reduced lake levels, and then, as we're seeing in the Canadian case, forest stress and wildfires. So the increasing wildfires that we're seeing in California and Canada and other states are partially because forests are incredibly sensitive to very minor changes in temperature. So like even a 1 degree change may be enough to really disrupt the equilibrium that a forest is used to. So this is a combination of both a natural cycle as well as a human-induced climate change is making the situation worse. Okay, so one of the aspects of this mega drought is that it is really affecting surface water in the Southwest. And in particular, there's in this right-hand side of your screen, you can see a picture of Lake Mead, and it's supposed to look like the far left-hand side, but right now it's looking like the far right-hand side. So at its height, Lake Mead is supposed to be able to hold 2 times the annual flow of the Colorado River. But right now, it is in an emergency and is at about 30% of capacity. And why should you care about that? Because Lake Mead provides 25 million individuals, humans, with water. It also, so the Hoover Dam dammed up the Colorado and created Lake Mead, so it's a man-made artificial lake, but it provides as much as 32% of Arizona's total water supply. And right now it's at about 34% capacity. It may have gone up slightly because of the heavy rains over the past winter. But what this means is that Arizona, which relies incredibly heavily on the surface flows of the Colorado River, is going to experience a 20% reduction in its allocation of the Colorado River. So if you look to the far right of your screen, you should be able to see a picture of the lower and upper basin of the Colorado River. So the Colorado River has its headwaters in Colorado, and then some of the water goes to Wyoming, some of it goes to Utah, some of it goes to New Mexico, and some of it goes to Arizona, and then the last bit of it makes it to California and Nevada. So we have this idea of the upper basin and then the lower basin of the Colorado River. But also some of the water, importantly, goes to the nation of Mexico, and there are reserved rights. So for my law students, we can talk about, reserved rights for Native Americans and how that might affect them. So this is, water reductions are sort of a slow-moving catastrophe, but one of the things I'm passionate about is getting people to understand that this is in fact a catastrophe and we need to really pay attention to it. Okay, so Arizona, somewhat bizarrely, has a fair amount of agriculture, which is heavily dependent on groundwater. So if you drive along I-10 on the bottom of Arizona, the highway that goes from San Diego across the US, that's I-10, you'll see lettuce farms. And Arizona has a pretty big population, 7 million people, and you have to take that population in light of the fact that the population probably far exceeds the water needed to support the population. So historically, farmers have, been able to use a combination of surface water and groundwater in Arizona, but now, because of the dramatic cuts in Colorado River water supplies, there will be a lot of pressure on groundwater. So the largest use for groundwater in Arizona is agriculture, and the state is already predicting deficits in groundwater by 2035, but that was before we even knew the Colorado River was going to be cut. So agriculture in Arizona is consuming about 70% of the water. And one really important idea is that 100% of the water that households utilize in Arizona actually comes from groundwater. So if you run out of groundwater, it means that you don't get water in your house for showering, for washing dishes, for cooking, or for drinking. So Arizona groundwater is pretty complicated, and that is what my working paper is exploring. And then there are two different regimes for water in Arizona. So one is surface water is governed by the idea of prior appropriation, and then groundwater is governed by the reasonable use rule, but also by the Arizona Groundwater Management Act. So I will kind of take a break and take some questions before I talk more about some of my research, because you guys are out in Vermont, so you don't use prior appropriation, you use a riparian system, which is pretty different. So I think it would be helpful to stop and talk about the differences between the system for a minute. Okay, so just a quick overview. We'll talk more about the Arizona Groundwater Management Act, but it's one of the earlier groundwater management acts in the nation. And what it does, its goals are to reduce overdrawing aquifers, and also it sets up a recharge system for Arizona groundwater, which is in and of itself controversial. And that beautiful blue ribbon you see going through the desert, that's the Colorado Arizona project, or I may have the acronym wrong, but basically it's a canal that moves Colorado River water through the middle of Arizona. Okay, so what I'm trying to investigate in my research is the idea of safe yield. So safe yield is a doctrinal research concept, or a doctrinal legal concept. And it's, if you think of it at its most basic, it's the idea that the withdrawal from an aquifer should match recharge. So you should never withdraw more from an aquifer than you're recharging. But different states have different ideas of what safe yield is. It's kind of a muddy concept that I'm trying to clarify in this article, but many states or many localities, they don't actually aim to have withdrawal match recharge. Instead, they just think of safe yield as the amount you can withdraw from an aquifer from groundwater without a disaster, without running out of water completely. So I want to stop PowerPointing at this and take some questions before I talk more about my paper.
So I'm not seeing any kind of midway questions yet.
Okay. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the idea of prior appropriation. I don't know if, I assume that in water law, the students here learn a little bit about prior appropriation. But so let me just give you kind of a quick overview between the way water law works in, let's say, east of the 100th meridian and west of the 100th meridian. So there's a line, it's an imaginary line, which goes from Canada down to Mexico, and it is called the 100th Meridian, and it passes through Oklahoma City, Austin, and kind of hits at the Gulf of Mexico. It goes through the states that are overlying the Ogallala Aquifer, Nebraska, the Dakotas. So this is an imaginary line, but it's kind of like the Continental Divide. So the Continental Divide, if you're to the east of the Continental Divide, the water flows east towards the Atlantic, and if you're to the west of the Continental Divide, the water flows west to the Pacific. So similarly, the 100th meridian is a line which demarcates areas of high rainfall and areas of lower rainfall. So to the east of the 100th meridian, which goes through Kansas and the Dakotas, and as we said, the middle of Texas and the middle of Oklahoma, you tend to have pretty high rainfall. And then once you go to the west, rainfall drops pretty dramatically. And you can see this in Texas and in Oklahoma. When you cross from, I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they call it green country in Oklahoma. But when you drive from eastern Oklahoma to Oklahoma City, it gets dramatically drier. So we generally think of water rate precipitation being below 20 inches to the west of the 100th meridian. And of course, there's an exception, which is the tropical rainforest in Washington and Oregon and Northern California and that part of the world. So Arizona is definitely pretty far to the west of the 100th meridian, and it's interesting if you think about agriculture, because historically the explorers had a misunderstanding and they thought that rain follows the plow. So they believed that if you would plow land, the rain would follow. And unfortunately, that is not the case. So part of what caused our Dust Bowl in the 1930s was that we had very delicate ecosystems. Some of them were grasslands, and some of them were just semi-arid. And when you plow them up, the land can no longer stabilize itself, and you get quite a bit of dust, and the land just has nothing holding it together anymore. So this is a situation which could definitely reoccur in the West and in the Southwest. One place you can see what a kind of existing Dust Bowl looks like is if you go to Midland, Odessa in Texas. That's a place where they've really, really overdrafted their groundwater, and it looks like a moonscape, a brown moonscape, but it's pretty scary looking. And then when you take water out of the ground at too high of a rate, when you overdraft or mine groundwater, then there are a lot of nasty side effects. One is that the land actually drops. There's something called subsidence, where the land actually drops when you're overdrafting water. And then, the most obvious problem is your well can no longer bring water up to the surface because the well bore can't reach the bottom to the aquifer. So you can't get water, but the ground can crack and houses can fall because the land is unstable. So there are quite a few pretty scary implications aside from not having water that you get from overdrafting. So just a reminder, if you're in the east of the 100th meridian, people tend to use something called the riparian system. I mean, I'm sure some of the viewers already know this and some of you don't, so let me just walk you through it. So out here in a place like Vermont, the idea behind the riparian system is there's plenty of water, and if you're along a water course, which could be a stream, a lake, a rivulet, you are entitled to use the water that flows along your property. So as long as your property is touching some water, you can use it. If your property is not touching water, you cannot use it. You have to be actually touching a stream or a river or a lake to be allowed to have access to the water. And furthermore, you have to use the water in the watershed. So one of the special aspects of riparian law is that there's an assumption that you're going to use the water near to the watershed or in the watershed. You're not allowed to move the water somewhere else. So in the West, in a state like Arizona, there's a very different system, and it's called, and this is for surface water. In Arizona, we have surface water is governed by prior appropriation, and groundwater is governed by the combination of the statute and something called reasonable use. So surface water in most of the West is governed by prior appropriation. That means the first person to get there has the best right to the water. And this is a system that was developed by a mixture of cultures. So it was developed by miners, people who are going to mine gold or pan gold in California. It was developed by Hispanics, the Spanish colonialists who came out and occupied much of the West before Anglo-Europeans got there. It was also developed by Mormons, who Joseph Smith is apparently from Vermont, and the Mormons who settled the West created a system of water which found its way. So you have the ability to sell and trade your water rights. So water becomes a commodity in the prior appropriation system. And then, so the system of reasonable use, which was the dominant groundwater system before Arizona passed the Arizona Groundwater Management Act, is an idea that you can use as much water as you need to from land that you own, as long as you're not harming your neighbor. So the only way to make your neighbor stop is if you can show that they're using an unreasonable amount of water or that their use is malicious. So they're wasting water and they're using something unreasonable. So that is the problem with that system. Each groundwater system has some problems, but this is essentially, they call it a vertical riparian rights system, which means you only get satisfaction after the fact. You have to bring a lawsuit to enforce your water rights, and you have to prove that your neighbor's water use is unreasonable. So that was the prevailing groundwater system in Arizona before the passage of the Groundwater Management Act. So then in 1980, Arizona passed one of the very first groundwater management acts. So it was aquifers, to create a system to allocate the state's limited groundwater resources, and then to augment Arizona's groundwater through water supply development. So the third idea is pretty innovative, and the idea is we could take Colorado River water and use it to refill depleted aquifers. That is an interesting topic in and of itself, but I will just mention it in passing. So groundwater, Arizona groundwater use is usufructory, which means users have a right to use water, but they don't have to have a right to use a specific kind of water or specific water that comes from a specific place. And one of the coolest aspects of the Arizona Groundwater Management Act is they're trying to reach a sustainable or a safe yield of groundwater resources, and the goal was to reach safe yield by 2035. But this is an aspirational goal, it's not a mandatory goal. So it is not, there aren't, things won't collapse if they don't reach that goal. So one of the things that happened from the Arizona Groundwater Management Act was that a state agency was completed, was created, and the goal and the objective of the state agency is to administer the Arizona Groundwater Management Act and to help ensure that the state actually reaches something called safe yield. So to get to that goal, the Arizona Groundwater Management Act created active management areas. And so the idea was, we're going to take the biggest population centers in Arizona and we're going to actively manage those. And the biggest population areas were Phoenix, the city of Phoenix, the city of Prescott, the city of Tucson, and Pinal. And then in 1994, another active management area was created called the Santa Cruz Active Management Area. So inside of the active management areas, groundwater use is much stricter than it is outside. So remember, I told you that the default in Arizona is reasonable use. But so if you're in one of these managed areas, active management areas, then you're not covered by reasonable use. You are covered by a statutory groundwater system that's specific to your city. So the statute also established a system of groundwater rights and permits. So if you were in a reasonable use situation, you would just withdraw as much water as you needed to irrigate your farm, and you don't need a permit, and there's not much oversight. But if you're in an active management area, you have to go to the state and ask for groundwater and get a permit for a specific amount of groundwater. And then there's no new irrigation, there's no irrigation of new agricultural lands within active management areas. And then each of these active management areas has a water management plan. And then, and this is probably the trickiest part of the statute, is before you build a new town, you're supposed to demonstrate there's assured water supply for 100 years for that new town or that new development. And then any well that's pumping more than 35 gallons per day has to be metered. They have to measure how much water they're withdrawing. So the effect is to limit groundwater pumping near Arizona's population centers. And it protects existing pumpers, but it limits new wells. So the goal is to get the quantity pumped by existing users, to limit that until the aquifers reach some kind of balance between inflow and outflow. And we call that balance safe yield. Now, safe yield varies state by state, and some areas think that safe yield means there's some water left in the aquifer. Some states think that safe yield means we deplete the aquifer or the groundwater in 20 years. And some states think, or some places think, that safe yield means, we're in perfect equilibrium. We're not withdrawing any more water than we are recharging. So you can actually purchase, just like you can purchase surface rights under prior appropriation, you can purchase groundwater rights. So if you're a new user, say you live in Scottsdale, the town of Scottsdale could go to an existing pumper and say, we want to buy 100,000 gallons per week from you. And they would, come up with some price for that. So there is a market price for water out in the West. And then the idea is that whenever you have a new city or town or a new subdivision, there should be an assured water supply. So an interesting question that would be cool to research someday would be, what does it take to demonstrate an assured water supply that is possibly subject to corruption? It'd be pretty easy to have fraud in making that demonstration. So how do we truly demonstrate an assured water supply? And we really have to think about exactly how many people are using exactly how much water for exactly how much time. So these are problems that you don't have in Vermont. You guys have a lot of water. It seems to rain every day here. There are brooks and streams and creeks and rivulets and rivers and lakes, and this is really different than when you're out west. So essentially, if you've been out to Phoenix or you've been out to Arizona, they have put millions of people in the middle of the desert. And I made a mistake. So the wells that pump 35 gallons or more a minute, if you have a well that pumps 35 gallons or more a minute, you have to have a meter to help the state collect data on aquifer conditions. So one thing that's interesting about aquifers or groundwater is we actually don't know that much about them. Like, we know they're there and we have a general idea of how much water they have, but we don't have a perfect idea of how much water they have. One way of figuring out how much water is in an aquifer is to have a bunch of measuring wells. So you put down a measuring well at, every acre or every 5 acres, and then you try to figure out at what point you hit water. So that is a not very precise way of figuring out how much water there is. There is the United States Geological Service and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. They have, of course, images, but groundwater is actually not as well measured as, say, as lakes. So one of the challenges we have is that each of the different active management area has a different management structure. So they're supposed to have a plan for each groundwater area, and the idea is to get to safe yield by 2025. And the idea would be that we have a sustainable water source despite growing demands. Now, the problem, this seems reasonable, right? This seems like a great goal and a terrific, reasonable idea. The problem is recharge. Recharge is really slow. So right now we're having enormous rains in California, and that seems great. But the problem is aquifers recharge at a pretty slow rate. So most aquifers, most groundwater was actually created by glacial water, and it's been stored for millions of years. So with diesel pumps, you can pump, 100 gallons of water per minute, but recharge it may take a year to recharge 2 inches of water in an aquifer. So there's a much higher depletion rate than there is a recharge rate. And each aquifer recharges at different rates. And that's because each aquifer, an aquifer is a fancy word for the area that encases the groundwater, is made out of different kinds of rocks, and different kinds of rocks have different kinds of permeability. So some aquifers recharge incredibly quickly, and some, they can recharge in 1 day of good rainfall, and some, like the Ogallala out over the Nebraska and Dakotas and parts of Oklahoma, parts of Texas, it recharges incredibly slowly. It can take 1,000 years to refill a foot of water. So there needs to be more attention paid to the exact details of the aquifer you're looking at and what it's going to take to create safe yield in that aquifer. So just to give you a sense of the variability of safe yield, so what I'd like to do with my article in the future is I'd like to kind of look at Arizona as a test case of safe yield, but also look at the idea of safe yield as a general idea in water law. So Idaho and South Dakota, South Dakota overlies the Ogallala. They want to limit withdrawal to the average annual recharge rate. This is a conservative policy. So you can only withdraw a certain amount of water, you can only withdraw the same amount of water that is actually recharging the aquifer. So in Oklahoma, the safe yield is not at all conservative, and they will simply let you mine or withdraw from the aquifer up to a 20-year time horizon. So you have 20 years to deplete the aquifer if it isn't protected. Kansas allows 40% depletion over 25 years. Colorado allows 40% depletion over 100 years. So the thing about safe yield is, although it is a legal concept, it also is very different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And that's sort of a general quality of water law that is stressful for students, because water law literally changes from state to state. So if you want to be a good water lawyer, you have to have a general idea of what's going on in the region and a very specific idea of what's going on in your home state, because each state, the state legislature really passes the laws that affect water usage in your state. Okay, so these are most of my ideas. So I was wondering if anyone had questions at this point.
Yes, and I will come back to help with that. So for the people who are watching, we do have a few minutes for questions, and you can enter your questions in the chat or the comment space on YouTube or on Facebook, and we'll get through as many as we can, and I'll pose the questions as they come in. So to kick us off, what challenges do you foresee in terms of the East having different water use laws than you've discussed today, but perhaps headed toward new water problems with climate change?
Okay, that's a very good question. So, the whole idea of riparian water law, which is the predominant form of law east of the 100th meridian, is that there's plenty of water. So this is great in a state like Vermont, where it seems to rain every day and there does seem to be plenty of water. So riparianism it's really based on a British and French system. So it's borrowed from the British and the French. So it's a post hoc system. It was really developed to help mill owners. So people who are running commercial mills, like making textiles or maybe milling grain, those were the big water users of their day in the 1800s. And so as the idea of riparianism is, you've got a river, it's flowing nicely, we've got a mill on it, and then let's say we have 5 mills on it. As long as all 5 mills can operate without a problem, then we'll never have a problem. But if one mill, probably upstream, is using too much water, then the downstream mill owners will be injured. And so essentially the people who are downstream have to bring a lawsuit against the upstream users and say, you're interfering with our use of the natural flow of the river. So riparianism sort of assumes that there's some kind of flow in the river and we want to keep it at a basic level. We don't want to use too much water so that we're interfering with that flow. But the problem with riparianism is it's a post hoc system. You don't get any relief until you sue. So it's very inefficient. And that meanwhile, somebody could be overusing the water. So you've got a problem with your neighbor overusing the water, and you're waiting for the lawsuit to wind its way through the courts, and meanwhile they're still overusing the water. So that is a serious problem with riparianism. Is it's post hoc, it's delayed, it's inefficient. And with climate change, we are, so one of the things to understand is riparianism really refers to surface water use, but the reasonable use law, which we talked about in Arizona, that's kind of a version of what we would call vertical riparianism, where you can use all the water you want from the aquifer until your neighbor gets upset and they sue you. Okay, but states like Florida, people are overdrawing for agriculture in a lot of different places that use the riparian system. Those include Florida, they include, weirdly, Mississippi and Tennessee, where you would think there's plenty of water because of the mighty Mississippi, but they've managed to overdraw their aquifer there for agriculture. Detroit, lots of areas of Michigan are overdrawing their water. So with climate change, this can have pretty dramatic results. So in Florida, when you overdraw your aquifer, not only don't you have enough water, but you get saltwater intrusion. The fresh water, the pressure of the fresh water in the aquifer is keeping the salt water at bay. But when you overdraw your aquifer in Florida, then the ocean water can rush in, and then you have a variety of problems, one of which is you don't have fresh water anymore. So if you were using the fresh water for irrigation, it'll kill the plants. If you're using it for drinking, you can't drink salt water. So a lot of states have moved to something called regulated riparianism, but it may be that some drier states, particularly on the border of the 100th meridian, may abandon the riparian system and move to more of a regulated prior appropriation system. Which has its own problems, but it is entirely possible that as we have less access to streams and lakes and rivers, riparianism will not be as effective in a period of climate change, but it will be a gradual process. The first move would probably be to regulated riparianism. Did that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Okay. So next, could you talk some more about the known effects of the megadrought on the ecosystems, namely the birds and animals in the area?
Okay, that's a good question. I am not going to be as expert on birds and animals, but I can give you a general answer. So I grew up in a state called New Mexico. That's New Mexico, not Mexico. It is a state. It's in between Texas and Arizona, bordered to the north by Colorado and Oklahoma. And what we are seeing was, we started to see 10 years ago, and I'm sure this is happening in Canada as well. Remember I said that with climate change, very small differences in temperature can have really dramatic ecosystem effects. So there is a plant called the pinon. It's just like a little shrub. It's what we call a tree out there. And there's pinyons and junipers, and they coexist in this very delicate balance with some moss and some bugs, and they need a hard freeze. So they really require an incredibly cold winter to be healthy. As long as things are cold enough, the bugs stay under control, but one temperature of climate increase or heat and the bugs get out of control. So there's something called the pine bark beetle that's been devastating for us in the Southwest. So that's a symptom of the megadrought. And so then you are getting into, there's no habitat for birds. The birds eat the pine nuts of the pinyons. They don't have a food source. So there's pretty extensive ripple effects. There's a pretty nasty cascade of effects on animals and birds. In terms of animals, you may see like bears getting closer to populate. We're building closer and closer into bears' habitat. But if there's a temperature change that's interfering with fish or with berries, they may not be able to get as much of their food. So they are wandering into population areas looking for food. Ungulates that rely on grass, if there isn't enough precipitation. There isn't enough grass. You should see, I would expect a die-off of ungulates. There's going to be competition between elk, moose, deer for the same amount of grass. There's also competition between those species and domesticated species. So those are just some of the, in terms of birds, it can interfere with their migratory routes. Birds want to go to somewhere where it's warmer when they're cold and so forth. So if those ecosystems shift upward or downward, that's going to interfere with butterflies and birds. And that's part of what we're seeing with the monarch. So that's why they're asking, like, I have a ton of milkweed in my garden. You want to create way stations for pollinators, which include bees and butterflies and birds, so that they have the food they like to eat, even as climate change progressive. Like, humans need to contribute to making sure that we have habitat. So those are just, as a total amateur, some answers to your question.
Okay, I'll ask one more audience question before we wrap up. What actions do you think the Texas government should take to preserve the aquifers out in West Texas?
Texas. Well, Texas has a particularly disastrous groundwater system. So Texas has something called the rule of capture. So it's one of the only states that still has that. Maine and Texas, and for a minute, California had it. But basically, the rule of capture says you own your land and you own everything up to the heavens and everything down to hell. And that includes all the water. So you can take out all the water that you want. And the only way someone can stop you is if they can show that you're malicious. So that's very hard to show. And the Texas Supreme Court has reaffirmed this idea repeatedly. So the first thing that Texas should do is stop using the rule of capture. The Texas state legislature needs to join the party and change its water law. So that's the absolute first thing that should happen. That would help. Another thing you can look at is, what are you growing? So cotton is a very popular crop in West Texas. It's also a very thirsty crop. There are some crops you'd be surprised at that need a lot of water, like the corn we use to raise, to feed cows and pigs is very water intensive. So looking at our crop choices. Some farmers have voluntarily moved to less water intensive crops, and some have not. But so one thing you could do to help our aquifers is to make better choices about crops. This is certainly also an issue in Arizona that I'd like to look into. Metering. Kansas is also kind of a drier state. It's not as dry as West Texas, but it's pretty dry. And they are really aggressive at metering. Colorado and Kansas probably represent best practices in water law, but I would say I'm kind of a fan of mandatory metering. Now, Texans really hate government intervention, so I wrote an article called, I wrote an article about the Ogallala Aquifer called Dust Bowl Waters. And in that article, I said, well, Texans really don't like government intervention, so maybe we can give them incentives to do voluntary metering. So if you agree to voluntary metering and maybe agree to only withdrawing a certain amount of water, you can get depreciation on farm equipment, tax incentives, refunds. The Farm Bill is I'm very impressed by the Agricultural Law Society here. But the Farm Bill has a lot of nice little benefits in it, and we can certainly use the Farm Bill as a way to give farmers incentives to make them behave in a way that is more water friendly. So those are just a few ideas, but I think, could we take one more question?
I don't think we can, actually, because folks have to get to class at 1. But I'm going to start calling Maine the Texas of New England. I think that the fact that they have the same water law has made me aware that there's actually a lot of similarities, I think, in terms of the attitudes toward government and freedom and independence. Okay, so thank you everybody who joined us today. We do need to wrap up. Thank you, Professor Bowman, for the presentation. And for those of you who'd like to join us again, we will have our next talk online, same place on Thursday of this week. Thanks a lot.